Welcome to this week's Torah lesson. This week's Torah portion is Parsha's Behaalotecha. The question of the week is, which part of the Torah is the most important? So in this week's Torah portion, Parsha's Behaalotecha, chapter 10, verse 35 and 36, you'll look before verse 35, there's an upside down nun, and after verse 36, there's an upside down nun as well. Why is that? So the Talmud in Tractate Shabbos tells us, because these two verses are its own book of Torah. So based on this, in this week's Torah portion, you have these two verses, which is its own book of Torah. Before these two verses, you have another book of the Torah, and after the two verses, you have another book of the Torah. So in this week's Torah portion, you have three books of the Torah. Not only that, this week's Torah portion is the third in the book of Bamidbar. So it's the third Torah portion. Again, you have the idea of three. But we see from this week's Torah portion that if you count these two verses as its own Torah portion, and the book and the verses before, from beginning of Midbar is its own Torah portion, the verses after its own. So in the book of Bamidbar, it's not one book, it's actually three books. So if you have four other books, and the book of Midbar is three, so you have a total of seven books. So it's not the 5 books of Moses, it's the 7 books of Moses. So which is interesting is because in the beginning of this week's Torah portion it says, when you light the candles, so how many candles are there? There's 7 candles. So in the book, in the Torah portion which creates the three books of Bamidbar, which makes total 7, there's a mention right in the beginning of the Torah portion about lighting the 7 candles. And we know it's brought down in the Zohar and Kabbalah that the candles resemble the Jewish people and resemble Torah. So you see a direct connection with the 7 candles and the different types of Jewish people and the 7 books of the Torah. So the Rebbe says we find something very interesting. When it comes to lighting the 7 candles, what does it say in this week's Torah portion? That it should be hammered out. When they made the menorah, it should be hammered out of one piece. Every different part of the menorah, the branches, the design was all hammered out of one piece. Why is that? Because when it comes to the menorah, even though there's 7 different branches, it's all out of one piece. So based on this, Rabbi explains, this is why when it comes to the Jewish people, even though there's different types of people, everyone has their area they excel in, we're all really coming from the same place. We're all part of one people. We're all part of Hashem. The same thing also when it comes to the Torah, even though there's different verses, and one is the 10 Commandments, and the Shema, and the unity of Hashem, and then it tells us simple stories, it's all part of the same Torah. So to answer the question, which part of the Torah is more important? They're all equal. They all are from Hashem, and any verse in the Torah you read, you are learning and connecting to Hashem. Thanks so much for joining us for our weekly Torah lesson. This week's Torah portion is dedicated to the memory of Baruch ben Aryeh Leib, Shlom ben Yosef, and Rachel bas Lipa. May their souls be elevated by the Torah we're studying in their memory. For more information, please see our website, Chabad, swf.org. Have a great and blessed week. Shavua Tov.